G'day. I'm the unsilent majority, Big Mouth.
Joining us as she does on a Thursday is New South Wales Liberal Senator Fierravanti-Wells. Connie, good morning.
Good morning, Stephen.
Connie, this is extraordinary. Paul Fletcher's got to step in and do something here, doesn't he?
Well, Stephen, I've been a long-standing advocate of one public broadcaster and merging the ABC and SBS with one charter that should be enforced, given the plethora of media that's already out there, particularly mainstream ethnic media, free-to-air pay, and so therefore that's where I see the necessary reform to our public broadcasting system, where a lot of these things, whether it's in relation to bias or the sort of issues that you've raised, are stringently reviewed under a charter that the board of this entity would ensure is maintained.
But the ABC's charter specifically already covers all of this kind of stuff. It's just basically ignored by its employees and nobody says anything about it. We talk about it, but nobody does anything about it.
Well, Stephen, in my early years as a senator, I took exception particularly to bias on the ABC and SBS, and I pursued these issues vigorously. The reality is that the ABC, the legislation that governs ABC and SBS makes it very clear that the responsibility lies with the board to ensure, particularly in relation to the ABC, that the broadcaster broadcasts in the interests and for the interests of all Australians. And so, therefore, there is a question of enforcement by the board of its responsibilities in compliance with that charter.
Moving right along, members of the coalition are calling for Australia to hold a diplomatic boycott of next year's Winter Olympics in Beijing. You've signed a letter proposing that our athletes still attend, but the government officials steer clear. Look, it's a no-brainer that there has to be sanctions against China for its attacks on human rights and democratic movements, but also on its the behaviour towards Australia. But we've got to separate sport from politics, don't we?
Well, this is a prestigious sporting event. It brings together nations to compete and showcase very much the very best, as we've said in our letter, of human athleticism. And however, China, as we know, is a communist dictatorship. It is responsible for a litany of human rights abuses. Of course, the most serious and egregious have been the ones that have emerged from Xinjiang province, where we've seen 1 million ethnic minority Uyghurs languishing in detention camps. And increasingly there is criticism by human rights organisations. So there is a difference. The boycott level is basically athletes do attend, but government's representatives don't attend. I mean, the alternative is that we as freedom-loving countries should not stand by and say nothing about this, because we know that the Olympics will be used by Beijing, will be weaponised. Beijing we cannot underestimate the propaganda value of holding the Olympics and how this will be used by Beijing to reinforce a whole series of messages and to allegedly vindicate its position on a whole range of different things.
You're the patron senator for a number of seats in Western Sydney, which are currently in the grips of these lockdowns because of the current coronavirus outbreak in New South Wales. The Committee for Sydney, an urban policy think tank, has called for vaccine passports. I have no problem with vaccines being mandatory in certain circumstances, but this seems to have torn the Liberal Party apart at a state level in New South Wales. What's your view on this?
Well, I agree that vaccine passports are a further erosion of fundamental freedoms, and the people who are putting forward views are reflecting, I have to say, the views of the considerable pushback that is happening. Indeed, I am receiving considerable correspondence, basically no mandatory vaccinations or vaccine passports. Now, Australians complied with the various access apps, but I do believe that for some, domestic passports are another matter. Look, Stephen, I don't have a problem with the International Certificate of Vaccination or the Yellow Book that's basically issued under international health regulations, and I would envisage that going forward there could be an electronic version of this international certificate of vaccination. Indeed, as a minister, I had to travel extensively, and I have a yellow book. My only concern about international certificates is so long as Beijing doesn't manage the database.
Yes, of course. I guess the difficulty is, though, unless we get our vaccination rates up, we're never going to get out of the mire we're in. But
well, Stephen, can I just say forcing people to vaccinate or requiring them to disclose their medical information is a dangerous precedent. It does threaten fundamental freedoms, and the government has maintained, and indeed following the National Cabinet on the 6th of August 2021, Scott Morrison issued a media statement where he underlined very, very clearly that Australia's policy remains that vaccines should be voluntary and free. And we have to also remember that under the Australian Immunisation Handbook, which is on the Department of Health website, that provides clinical advice for health professionals in relation to vaccine practice. And one of those criteria includes a section in relation to valid consent. And valid consent has 4 key elements, one of which it must be given voluntarily in the absence of undue pressure, coercion or manipulation. So yes, it is a very challenging area, but we do have to balance the views on both sides of the equation.
Well, no two ways about that. I think that's a good point. Connie, good to talk to you. We'll catch up again next week.
Thanks very much, Stephen.
All the best. Fierravanti-Wells, New South Wales Liberal Senator, back with us next week on the program. It's 7:17.